Then, do not give up, Thyra implored, taking Osrith's hands in her own, delicate ones. They were cold, and Osrith buried them in her own to warm them for her. Whatever route you must take, you should never stop trying. Then, she pulled away from Osrith and looked up. The sky was brightening, and it was making to be a cold afternoon in the weak sun. The saints are like the gods, she mused, half to herself, like, they are next to the Allfather, God. Osrith thought of those words as she was lying alone beside Finan, though at that time had not noticed the implication of Thyra bringing her hand to her lower stomach as she stood, thinking, before she and Bika left Dunham. Finan was not himself, Osrith thought, and when she began to kiss him again, to see whether it would lead to a second time. And she wanted that, for she had suspected that she would need to leave Dunham quickly, maybe even as early as that night, and did not know when she would see him again. Here, Osrith said, finding Finan's hand and pressing the silver coin into it. She felt Finan's breath near her shoulder. Keep it, he murmured, folding her hand around it, then shuffled in the straw. Offered the silver back, he folded her hand around it. It is dangerous here, Osrith, he cautioned. I have heard talk of, Osrith prompted. A fracture in this army. Utad for one is spoiling to challenge Sigurd. Blood Ragnar is hosting that Scottish bastard's offspring for him for an alliance. He sighed into her hair. I would have you go quickly, tonight if ye can, Osrith. If ye plan to. Finan reached to hold her tightly and Osrith yielded to what would be their place together in one another's arms. All the protection that you once had under Ragnar is now gone. What? Osrith sat up, her breasts brushing Finan's chest as she did so. From below, a voice called, for Finan to join him. Her brother. Osrith felt a rise of anger. You have declared yourself to be Imrison, and as such, an enemy to Ragnar and his army, he explained, and then exclaimed, Oh God, Osrith, did ye not know? Osrith scrambled to her feet, dressing as best as she could in the darkness, before turning to find Finan, kiss his lips once more. Go, he insisted. Take whatever you can. I asked ye before, but ye did not answer, Osrith. He broke off, and then added, as if debating whether to ask the next question, will you wait for me in Mercia? Osrith took Finan's face in her hands, and kissed him firmly. I will. 88,888,888. Over the stable roof Osrith managed to creep, and across to the ramparts. It was a new moon, ideal for being unseen, and she got her leg over the wooden parapet. It would have been all right, Osrith considered, later, if she had not ignored the Danish guard, who was semi-recumbent, leaning against the palisade wall in a position implying he was looking out into the blackness, but really he was half dozing. You won't see many enemy by doing that, Osrith scolded him, in her mind, and made to step over his leg when a pair of hands gripped her shoulder. No time for tags. Sword as the hands threw her to the wooden railing, and Osrith fought, but to no avail. It was Heston. Going somewhere. The Danish leader growled near her ear, and Osrith struggled until he slapped her face, and even then she kicked his shins, making him roar. But she had miscalculated Heston's swing, for it caught her head. Osrith hadn't ducked in time and she lost her footing, tumbling down into the blackness. It wasn't a very long fall, but Osrith fell on her chest, winded. Beside her, Heston sprang, his footsteps next to Osrith. And that is what happens when you trust a stinking Saxon, Heston declared, pulling Osrith by the hair, escaping to sing to whoever she could find about a huge army at Dunham marching south. Around them were gathered men, Danish guards, and in the courtyard strode the Jarls, Ragnar Ragnarsson and Sigurd Bloodir. I am going north, Osrith protested. So you say, Heston spat back. Yet, you had the chance to go north yesterday, and you didn't take it. Anyone so desperate to get back to their homeland would no longer be in Dunham tonight. And Heston held her head back with her hair and punched her in the stomach. Stop. Beside Heston, Ragnar held up a hand. Heston, who was about to hit her again, stopped. It can only be death, said Ethelwold, who was beside Ragnar, with glee. She could be kept. She would make a good whore, Blood put in. Ragnar turned to look at him. She would kill you when you slept, Brida replied, scornfully. Are you sure you are not a Dane? Ragnar asked her, dryly, to which Osrith withdrew away. Heston's eyes saw the blade, and Osrith smiled. Isma's Gaelish. Wak ilt, she shouted, loudly, so everyone could hear her, and she knew by the flick of the boy's head that Constantine's son had heard her words, and understood them, and Osrith found his eyes again, and smiled. Wak ilt, Ragnar repeated, shaking his head at the unknown word. But it had caused the effect Osrith had wanted in the face of Heston, who backed away from her quickly. Kriegvikvind, Osrith clarified, and Ragnar's eyes widened. How do you know that word? He asked of her, and Osrith realized that most if not all of the inhabitants of Dunham were surrounding her now. What is Kriegvikvind? Ethelwold asked, narrowing his eyes to Osrith. Beside him, Brida and Utad stepped a little nearer, leaning in to hear the Ragnar the Fearless, the highest honor that a Northwoman can have. There was a change in the air, a murmuring which seemed to undulate around them all, as Danes spoke to Danes. The word was well known, almost mythical. The battle women had the highest status in Valhalla, beyond even the men. They were close to the gods. It didn't matter that Osrith was a Gael or, more specifically, a Saxon. She had been declared Kriegvikvind, and that was what mattered. And so, Osrith pressed on, in the Norse that Eric had taught her. I use my right as Kriegvikvind to press that my word is true. She watched Ragnar carefully, and he shifted his weight between his feet. I understand you offer freedom for a fight successfully won. No Dane will fight you, Ragnar replied. Eric fought me, Osrith said in Norse. Ragnar's brow pinched as he thought about the unusual words. He was a fool he could not take Alba. And you could? She watched as Ragnar shook his head momentarily, his eye drifting to their Gaelish hostage. Prince Selark stared back to Osrith, but said nothing. There is strength in Alba that there is not in the south. What does that mean? Asked Ethelwold, assuming, rightly, that Osrith was not going to be put to death on the say-so of Heston. That she has the protection of every Dane here, Ragnar explained, and turned to Osrith, clapping her on the shoulder. Then fight for your right, Kriegvikvind, he declared, and the fortress rang with cheering and hooting and thumping on the ground with feet and spear butts, approving the entertainment as decreed by their leader. But who? It was the Jarl Sigurd who asked Ragnar, standing next to the Fearless. No Dane will fight a Kriegvikvind. But Osrith had already decided. Utad, she declared, pointing Bue at her brother. He had pissed her off a naught, and she was about to humiliate himself in front of the people he claimed to belong. He did not belong with Danes. He would be gone as soon as the army had left Dunham, to find the Lady Ethelfled. Though it was clear she had fine and were forming an attachment, he was going out of his way to divide them. Why? Spite? How was it, Osrith thought, and not for the first time, that her brother could make monumental mistakes and still brazen his way to the top of everything. He was a fraud. Utad, Ragnar repeated, then looked at Osrith curiously. Utad, why? Why? Because he is neither a Dane nor a Saxon, Osrith declared. Ragnar closed in on Osrith, and stood inches from her. Explain to me what you mean, Gale. Because of the oath he has sworn to the Lady of the Mersons and the oath he had by family. Osrith heard herself bite the word. Who will he choose? One thing I know, he will not think with his head. That is a lie. Utad stormed to her, approaching Osrith beside his Danish brother. But a calm had overtaken Osrith, and she made sure that she did not take her eyes off Ragnar the Fearless. If it is, ask him. Jarl Ragnar, is he joining you? With satisfaction, Osrith watched as Ragnar turned to Utad. Well, Utad did not answer, and Osrith did not deny that she enjoyed Utad's adopted brother shrink a little at his words, feeling then as she had felt since she had found him. Unless he will not fight you, Ragnar replied. It was subtle, and Osrith applauded the Danish warrior for his covert use of language. She deduced that, what Ragnar meant was, if he were indeed a Dane, he would not accept the challenge. He will fight you, Utad declared, bearing down on her, and fell into the trap. Oh, Osrith, what have you done? Finan said, under his breath, and it was only then that Osrith realized he was standing beside Utad. She ignored him, and continued to stare down Uhtred as he stared back at her, with equal vehemence. "It is agreed, Jarl Ragnar," Osrith concluded, turning at last to the Danish leader. "I defeat Uhtred of Bibbenberg, this secures my release." "Agreed," Ragnar replied, and Osrith watched Heston fold his arms, disgruntled. Osrith knew very well what he would have liked to happen to her, though maybe reminding him that she had been subnamed after the vengeful goddess of the sea might have quieted him. "Agreed," Ragnar repeated. "And if you lose, your death." This was Ethelwold, and he looked gleefully at her. "Harsh, Lord Ethelwold," Heston piped up. "I think this witch could be of use." "My death," Osrith agreed, making sure she did not look at Finan. She had no capacity to deal with how he might be feeling at this time. "And I go free when I win." She saw out of the corner of her eye Uhtred bristle at the word when. But now Heston was keeping quiet no longer. "What is to stop her from telling people our plan?" It was a fair point, and one which a lot of the Danes were agreeing with one another about. "Me alone?" Osrith dismissed, with a laugh. Who would listen to one person alone? And then Ragnar the Fearless said something which, if she had had a mind to do, would definitely have put her brother's nose out of joint. "You could stay here, fight with us." There was a plan forming in Ragnar's mind, and Osrith admired the man. A Krigic Vind on the side of this huge army marching on Wessex. He would have been mad not to make that offer to her. Osrith inhaled, deeply, as if giving his idea a good deal of thought. Then, she shook her head. "None of this is my fight, though I am Anglish. My heart, my core is of Alba, of Aryan," Osrith added, making sure she was loud enough for Finan to hear her. And she was amazed to see Uhtred back away from her. But it was a ruse, though it had fooled some of the watching Danes, who gasped at the ferocity of Uhtred's attack. She had this, Osrith knew, and Bué matched the blow, and she pushed him back, forcing her legs to drive Uhtred back. With her frame, it wouldn't last too long, but it was enough for Osrith, the more lithe of the two, to be able to step away in time for Uhtred to stagger, her hair flying round like a mane. "I bested you twice," she reminded him as Uhtred flew back at her. "Kneel before me and call me lord," her brother demanded. "And while you're down there," Osrith thrust Bué towards his arm, scoring a line of red in his jerkin, which did, quite satisfyingly, wipe the grin off Uhtred's face. "I kneel before God, unless that's who you think you are these days." Another clash of blades. She would need to steal more of Uhtred's silver when she next went to a blacksmith, Osrith thought. "I have often been called it," Uhtred gasped, trying the trick of making his enemy hold their sword high, having blocked an overhead parry, "especially when I've been up to my hilt in a woman. There might be anything in there. Or nothing." Osrith shot back, plunging Bué near his chest. Uhtred moving just in time. Finan shook his head. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear," he muttered, as Osrith went for his leg, then levelled serpent breath, but Osrith had now abandoned her sword and had run at his legs, tackling Uhtred to the ground, laying blow on blow, not caring now that to her this wasn't a fight to prove her place. This was her anger at his uncalled for resentment to her, at the fact that not one person in the monastery thought to send for help for Gisela, at having been left there in Bibbenberg, by the brother she had dreamed of. Then, Osrith stopped, and leaned close to Uhtred's ear, telling him that what Boka said was true. His eyes widened at her words, and at this mistake of listening to an enemy rather than fighting them. Osrith pulled out tagged seeks, making to plunge it into him. Around her, no Dane made to move to help Uhtred. No Dane said a word. And then Osrith moved aside and got to her feet, sheathing tagged sword, and reaching for Bué, which was in the dirt beside her brother, and finding its scabbard too. "I declare you victor," Ragnar said, as his eyes moved from Uhtred, now sitting himself up, pain from Osrith's blows to his body causing him to wince, and back to Osrith, who was standing still and silent, but with her weapons not so far from her hands that she could use them. Ragnar strode to her. "You are free to go." And he beckoned to Jackdaw, who pushed through the Danes and called for him to bring a horse, ignoring Ethelwold's plaintive objections to it being improperly concluded, and the fight for a fiat. "Tell me the truth, will he go?" Ragnar asked, as he walked with her to Dunham's Gate. Osrith looked into a face with as much honor as she could imagine anyone to have. It was no wonder Bryda clung to him, no wonder she had given up entirely her original life to be with him. "I cannot say for sure," Osrith said, honestly. "What does your heart tell you, Ragnar the Fearless?" Ragnar stopped and lowered his hand from her shoulder. "I have to believe he is my brother, and in his word," he replied, then lowered his head to Osrith. "What is he to you?" And Osrith told him. Ragnar said nothing at first, then nodded his head, once, firmly. "That you have not told him. I will not tell him," Ragnar said. Looking back, Osrith wondered whether a lot of things would be better if Ragnar had done so. "If he leaves, it is only the same as what he did to you," he concluded. "No." Osrith shook her head. "You were a family to him. And you lost your home because we came. You lost a brother, 2 brothers, as I am about to lose a brother. And others lost their homes when the Saxons came, and others lost their homes when the Gaels came, when the Cymry came, when all the nations that have come ever to this land." Ragnar smiled, and clapped her on the shoulder. "I hope the best for you, Osrith Lackland, and when we meet in the battlefield, don't." Osrith thought. "Don't say you will turn from me." "May your God be with you." Osrith smiled at the Dane. "May yours be for you, all of them. And if you ever get to Alba." Ragnar gave her a wry smile, and turned to go as Osrith readied to mount the horse he had so generously given to her. "Jarl Ragnar," Osrith said, as he began to stride away, and she followed him for a few steps. "You did not take every scrap of silver of mine." Osrith reached for his hand and pressed the silver piece into it. "It was a dream lost, of her and Finan." "I will return it," he said, and then strode off back inside his fortress. 88,888,888. Osrith rode north. But this did not last very long, and within a few miles her horse was turning south, and she would soon be in Aylesbury. And indeed it was. 3 days later, as she stood before the capital of Wessex, she would see no one other than Ethliard, waiting for whatever was going to happen. And her arrival was so sudden that Aldhelm had not had time to even see that she was coming. He was standing beside Ethliard, which was a good sign, but with such a pained expression in his face that Osrith felt sorry for the man. It was only after a few moments into her discussion with the Lord of Mercia that she realized Aldhelm probably thought she was going to admit their part in Saltwick and the Lady Ethelfled. "Aldhelm has made me aware of your aversion to Wessex," Ethliard told her, in what seemed to Osrith like a shift in mood. "You chose to return to me when you could have gone anywhere. You are loyal to Mercia, and to Ethliard, and shall be rewarded." Osrith stepped lightly from foot to foot as she waited for Ethliard's decision. And, as she watched, Osrith saw the figure of Eardulf. Ethliard must have noticed too, but he alluded little to the last time she and Eardulf were before him, in that very room. All Ethliard said was, "Your debt is paid. Go, and be in my army." Nothing was mentioned of assassination, failed, or otherwise. Miral was the first to see Osrith as she stalked along the corridor to the armory. He challenged her, that men were forbidden with the officers, and that Osrith, who he assumed to be a mercen soldier, which is she indeed was, should not be there. "Will you be bringing me my clothing then, Lord Miral?" Osrith asked, and watched with satisfaction when the man's face changed as he recognized her. "Osrith," he declared, clapping her on the back, and he was shortly followed by Aldhelm, who was also following. "I take it you have reconsidered your decision to be auxiliary captain?" Aldhelm asked, taking Osrith into the armory. "Yes," she conceded. "And it took you nearly a month to decide?" "A month, having been captured by Danes." "And Ethelwold?" And Osrith watched Aldhelm's face as he told him of where she had gone and what she had done. "They let you go?" "Only after I had fought their bravest warrior." "Only, their bravest warrior turned out to be Utad." Aldhelm exhaled, realization showing in his features. "So, that is where he is?" Osrith nodded. "And Ethelwold is with him?" Aldhelm nodded, grimly. "The Lord Ethliard seems happy." Osrith changed the subject. "Indeed. Alfred sickens, so he tells himself that he is not far away from the throne of Wessex." Aldhelm looked embarrassed, but pressed on. "I took the liberty of telling the Lord Ethliard your story of Oswald, that you told, of when the Danes came to Northumbria, and you were comforted by the monk beads stories. We know that Oswald brought light into the dark place." Osrith agreed. Aldhelm put a hand on her shoulder. "You're absolved of this, Osrith," said Aldhelm, seriously, "all of it. You may leave the army." Osrith was shocked. "Me? You mean must?" "Surely not. It is all that was good in the world, a place she was respected for her ability to fight, not what she could do on her back, or what she could be consigned to when one man or another decided what she was to be fit for." "Have you no other options in life?" asked Aldhelm, gently, and Osrith realized that he meant to be kind. "None." "Give me command, any command, if you don't think I can command a battalion." But Aldhelm knew her better than that. She had commanded a battalion, she had commanded a squadron which had not only survived a battle against Danes at Beamflout, but had lost not one single man. "I will suggest again the role of auxiliary captain," Aldhelm went on, "which means the men know you are a commander in any part of the Mercen army. They will know and trust you, you can lead any men, at any time." And Osrith agreed. She was grateful for this, though she had proved her worth often enough. But there was nothing like knowing your men to get effectiveness in war. "Danes are near, some Danes, though not the ones you have told me about," Aldhelm summarized. And he gave her new clothes, and armor which, for once, fitted well. She was back. 88,888,888 Danes were near. Small bands of them were still raiding across Watling Street, although they seemed to have focused their attentions to the stretch of the border between Hunstanton and Lundin. It might have been a ruse, she suggested to Miral, beside whom she commanded in her first assignation, as they stood in the dark of the night, watching for incursions or other factions, he suggested, and they played the game of most as they waited in the darkness, about their now long departed Lord Offa, and their shared experiences in Devonshire, most ugly ... most cowardly ... most stupid, and so on, as they raked the night for flickers of life. It was after one such night on a return patrol that they arrived at the gates of Aylesbury's Hall to see the rear of a train of carts that were heading into the city. "The king," declared a priest. When Miral asked of Wessex, the man added when he spotted the colours of Mercia, green and gold, in Miral's clothing, and Osrith felt a little embarrassed at herself when she recognized him, as he returned to King Alfred's retinue. They watched as the king got down from one of the carriages, refusing to be helped by anyone, and keeping a stiff, upright form. But it was that stiffness which betrayed him, that Alfred was indeed very ill. Yet, he had seen fit to travel all this way to speak to, presumably, the Lord Ethelred. But it was the person who came next out of the carriage which would occupy Osrith's thoughts as she was given leave, went with Miral to the Bull Inn, near the eastern part of Aylesbury, and enjoyed a jar of milk as Miral relaxed in the company of two other commanders also given leave. "We met at Lundin," came the same voice who had spoken to them that day, and Osrith turned her head full of distracted thoughts to look at the priest. It was Father Pyleig, and Osrith realized at once where she had seen him before. Besides being Alfred's priest, Osrith had watched him fight for his freedom, under terms agreed by Eric and Siegfried. In fact, it was that fight that had given her inspiration at Dunham. "I think you fought bravely, Father," Osrith said, when she had told him she remembered the day. But it became clear that Pyleig had not come for small talk. "The Etheling, Edward, asked me to find you," Pyleig went on, "and make you aware he is in Aylesbury. Though what for, I cannot imagine," he added, looking at her disapprovingly. "There is only one way to find out," Osrith replied, with stiff politeness. "If you will excuse me," she added, this time to Miral, and he nodded as she got up. To her disappointment Pyleig followed her. "I should add, he is married," Pyleig said. Osrith stopped, and turned to face him. If Siegfried's best warrior could not defeat him, then perhaps Osrith the Mercen would try. "What is it that you suppose of me, Father Pyleig?" Osrith asked, her guilt at his probable correct assumptions swamped by overweening self-righteousness. "Is it because I am a female?" "No," Pyleig replied, placing a hand firmly on her forearm, and looking at her intently. because he is a male. Osrith nodded slowly. He was being cautious for her, which was touching. Do you know why he wants to speak to me? I do not. And, as she turned to go to find the Lord Edward, Osrith noticed, with disappointed resignation that, despite what he could have done, Uhtred of Bibbenberg had not stayed with his brother, but brought his men, Skade and the Lady Ethelfled, to Aylesbury. 88,888,888. It is good to see you. Edward was in a script room at the far end of the palace at Aylesbury when Osrith found him. He was looking at some manuscripts, his hair neatly styled as his eyes strayed over illuminated letter after illuminated letter. Osrith said nothing for some time, her eye half hypnotized by a guttering candle near one of the windows, and so lost in thought she became that it took the Etheling's low, clear sounding of her name for Osrith to look at him. You sent for me, Lord Prince? Edward nodded his head once, and stepped towards her. A Danish army is heading our way, did you know? He circled back to the table, which held, Osrith could see, a map of Brittany, of the country. At the top, in a wide section, which almost looked like a peninsula, was Alba, and she scanned down it at the heptarchy marked out. A landmass, almost rectangular in size but with scant markings, was labelled, Ireland. I cannot take on an army of this magnitude by myself, Edward told her, plainly. I have asked for Peleg to wait outside, for I do not wish anyone, least not the king, to know I am speaking to you. You are not of the Witan, but, and here it was when the prince made the corner of Osrith's heart disintegrate, and with it, the rest of her senses. It is your opinion I value the most, Osrith, for you can see things I cannot. Tell me, he continued, placing a hand on Osrith's shoulder, his face agonizingly earnest, what chance would I, alone, have, of defeating this army in its entirety? Osrith looked from Edward's hand, along his arm and up to his face. Though he was a man, a young man, there was still a certain vulnerability about his character that made Osrith turn to him. Do you believe that dividing the army in some way would make a difference? And Edward's face regained a little more of his composure, for he knew then that his old guard and lover understood exactly his concern. I believe it could slow them down, far better than one big battle. Osrith, I cannot manage a great army, command all our allies, not yet. I do not have the strength, or the influence over men my father counts on. Seigebri of Kent, Osrith thought. You took Ecgwin from him, married her, fathered twins. Only now you realize the value of playing the long game, where an alliance might make all the difference, and the rest is just base entertainment. Was your father ready? Osrith asked him, concern showing on her face. No. He just had to act and do what he could. He had little time to think. She crossed to the map, looking at the markings upon it, new marks, perhaps troop maps, in the western section of East Anglia, where little bands of Angles willing to fight with Mercia against the Danes were depicted, where Cent was added, with a big arrow from the bottom right, where Mercia and some allies in the border regions of Cymru would add to the fight. But Edward did not have one clear consistent voice as Alfred did. Ethan Dunn, though mightily knife-edge, had given one thing to Edward's father that Edward could not attain, unity based on a common cause. Yes, there were Danes, there always were. But what the Etheling didn't see was what it was that tied all of these disparate peoples together, that he could use to wield them. Osrith couldn't tell the Etheling what it was, either. He had to discover it for himself. This is a long-term strategy, Osrith said, looking back to him, and sometimes unsavory things have to be done, quick decisions made, and that is the other part of you. You have the grace and ability to make people listen to you. It was Osrith's turn to approach Edward now, and touch him on the arm. You should do what you believe is right, if in your heart you feel it is the right thing to do. I feel this is the right thing to do, Edward said, and pulled Osrith to him, kissing her deeply, longingly, needfully. Peleg was right, Osrith knew, when the Etheling tried to reach for her body, and she pulled away, firmly, fervently hoping that he had listened to her words. She broke off, and stepped from Edward. No, she scolded him, silently. Listen to my words, they are more valuable than your libido. Yet, Osrith knew it was not just the physical act that Edward felt, there was a closeness between them. He trusted her, to a point. He had just asked her for her advice and for someone else to find her. There was a genuineness to the Etheling, and that made the difference. Find a way, Osrith urged, your way, that unites every one of your factions against them. She trailed her hands over his shoulders and down his arms, finishing by taking his hands. Go to Buka, to Pyleague, ask them for help, they are neutral. And then Osrith kissed Edward this time and told him it was good to see him too, before he strode out of the room, and down the corridor to Mercia's throne room. 88,888,888 Ale or milk? Osrith stood in the front of the baron this time, and watched as Osferth moved shamefaced away from the table at which were assembled Utard, Finan and Sifik and Edward and Ethelfled. The earnest-faced man looked up to her and on recognizing her, shook his head. It was no wonder Ethelwold wanted to drink those days back in Winchester as decisions passed him by, and she smiled encouragingly at Osferth. It could be worse. She nodded towards them. It could be worse. My mother could have been married to Alfred rather than be his maidservant. Osrith nodded again and placed a hand on Osferth's arm. I wish I understood. I think it must be difficult.